Anyway, now I'd like to turn to Paul Schreck for part two of his presentation on how he builds his yards. Paul, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Let me pull up the PowerPoint for it. Had some fun going and adding more things to what I did last week, because I managed to get through everything that I pulled together last week in 20 minutes time. Today I'm going to watch the time, so I know I keep it down to 15 minutes. So here is part two. On YouTube, our Piedmont Pilgrimage posts the videos from our October and November open house that we do, but this year was still largely virtual. So there's a nice 6-minute video of mine for people who want to look at the whole layout and how I got going with it. So with let me click on there so it'll go down. There we go. A couple more yard configurations to make sure that I covered a few extra things. Some of these came out of a 1955 edition of Model Railroader. John Armstrong wrote the article, so I'm going to borrow from some of his wisdom. I love this particular one that has a nice sloping yard on the left where the cars can, in theory, roll down on their own once they get past the hump at the top. Engine servicing stuff in the middle, and then caboose track off on the side. The challenge with this is what kind of a room are you going to be able to put this in with the main line coming in from a vertical direction. It's because this is already 1.5 feet wide or so. But I also like that it's got the Y in the middle of it if you need to be able to turn an engine. A couple of other quick ones, because he talks about, as I did last week, that pros and cons of a double-ended yard versus a diamond yard that can be double-ended, or the stub ending. Mine uses double-ended for the arrival and departure tracks, and then has 6 stub tracks on the east end of the yard. A friend of mine is working on getting his yard going. It's functionally an inverted pyramid scheme, except that on the right-hand side, you may have to move your people so you can see over there. On the right-hand side, he's got a lead track coming into the yard from the southeast, and a yard entry over on that side, as well as the yard entry here and the lead track. And it's basically an upside down pyramid. And then you've got this as another option for super simple, just a real small terminal for engine, place to turn your engines around, using a Y to turn an engine around at the end of a point-to-point layout. Another option for a Y with a runaround track. I love having runaround tracks. And then I particularly liked this simple small town yard that comes in. It's a terminal yard. So trains will come in from the main line. Your passenger trains can come in here. The departing passenger cars will head out here. You've got classification tracks in here. There's a road with factories along here, so you can have a team track that's being shared by those factories. And it happens in a fairly small space. John Armstrong has his own 9 points to watch out for in doing yard operation. This is, again, from the August 1955 issue. You can read these, but I'll go along with you. Study everything that you want the yard to be able to do, whether you do it in your head or, like me, if you've got to see it on paper before actually finalizing your track plan for the yard. Keep the track leads clear of other traffic that would interfere. You saw that last week with the image of having the entry point into the yard that conflicts with what the lead track is doing. He likes having more short tracks, 3-car minimum, rather than longer ones. The versatility that you get is worth, he thinks, the extra number of turnouts and toggle switches that you'll have. Pay attention to the kind of coupler you're using. Nowadays, that may not be an issue, but paying attention to those and choosing what kind of coupler you're going to be using and how you'll get those to uncouple. Back in the days in the 55 era, there were a lot of number 4 turnouts. I said, avoid those, particularly if you've got long cuts of cars, because the physics of a string of cars being pulled off a number 4 turnout runs more of a risk of derailment. And he says that's so important, say it twice. Keep your ladders and throats close to the aisle so that they're accessible in case you need to do maintenance and for operational purposes. Do your best track work construction when you're doing your ladder tracks. If your yard is flat, have your lead track such that cuts of cars are pushed downhill and are pulled uphill if you're going to have things that aren't all on the same level. Watch out for S-curves, again, because of the physics and the greater risk of a derailment. Track spacing. Back in 55, at any rate, the NMRA standard for that was 2 inches for HO scale, which I think translates at 16 feet. Most modelers, he found back then, seemed to prefer 2 1/4, which is what I have on my classification tracks. And thus the value of having one of these that I learned from experience. You really want to set it all the way down onto the rails when it's over the coupler, because the magnetic field works better when it's lowered all the way down to track level. But it works quite well for being able to have the couples open up on the 2 cars. Not that that necessarily replaces having a magnet under the track. A few other loose ends. What about lighting? To quote from Armstrong's article, an indispensable part of any large yard is a system of floodlights on towers to illuminate the scene. The lead tracks in particular want to be well lit. Down on the classification tracks, things can be dimmer, but you still want them bright enough to serve as a deterrent to theft and to keep a trimmer crew from failing to see a flat card at the end of a cut they're working with and ramming it under a reefer. Coach servicing yards are also brightly lit in modern practice, at least back in 1955. Terminal versus through yard. He seems to clearly prefer a through yard. The idea for him of having, to quote him again, there's no point, simply no point in rolling a 10-car train up to the end of a branch, interchanging the engine and caboose, and then heading back up the line. The fact that this is what goes on in many model railroads, at least in 55, who take pride in their point-to-point plan, says to him, it doesn't make sense. Think it over. If you're going to have if you're going to do point-to-point, small yard, keep the trains running short. Where to put the engine terminal? He finds that location is not so critical in the yard, and it's often determined by fixed items like in local conditions, such as your water heater and your laundry tub. The last house that I was in 2 houses ago, the layout was an oval shaped that had the furnace and the water heater inside the oval. And the guys who came to do the work on it remembered it every time because I had to duck under the trestle bridge to be able to get in to work on it. Where to put the caboose track? Many of the guys slept on board the caboose in between stops, in between runs. So it was courtesy not to store the caboose where there was going to be a lot of noise. You wanted to put it farther away from noisy areas of the freight yard. Passenger station facilities, Armstrong says you can put them right next to your tracks on your freight yard, But it can get a little crowded there for operational purposes. And he seemed to prefer having them farther down so that you've got two different places to give attention to, not just, you can have the freight yard and the passenger station area. One of the 9 commandments or 10 commandments last week that I went over for freight yard modeling, number 9 is thou shalt not overcrowd the yard. And I got this picture from a friend this week who's in our in-town modeling group here in Atlanta. And he said, oh, maybe I'm a little overcrowded over the 50% figure. This is one of the yards that Armstrong showed in that article for small towns that don't have a freight yard with yard limits to it because it's going through town with a lot of industries on the side. And the nice thing about this is that you've got a lot of visual stuff to hold your attention with the different industries. Joe Nichols Sr. has one like this on his layout just a couple blocks away from me. If you can see that one on YouTube from the Piedmont Division, by all means, check it out. One of the things to watch out for, though, with something like this is if you can see the arrow over here on the right side of the screen, those tracks there on the right, that's about 14 inches right there. So you got another foot up there. And if you come down here, you've got probably 2.5 feet. So if your aisle is down here where the text is, you're not going to be able to reach all the way back here. So if you're going to do this kind of a thing, you may want to have the edge of your layout following along much closer to the edge of the rails so that you've got room to be able to reach behind to get the ones that are up here. What I did on my layout was something very similar to this for the Lawrence area of the layout. Can I move this down some? Whoops, wrong button. Nope, can't do that. Okay. What I've done is to have the industrial sidings that run much more parallel to the 2 main lines. Let me move this out of the way again. Whoops, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button there. The 2 lines here head back to Boston, and the main lines come through, and you can have a runaround track on either side of those to be able to drop things off. And you've got a long lead track up here to be able to store cuts of cars, as well as a spare track next to the brewery over here. Got 6-7 minutes left. This is what that yard looks like in reality there, with the brewery on the back, with empties that can be stored here, a spare track here for holding cars that aren't ready to be shipped out yet. There's space for a couple more cars here. There's a gantry crane for a siding here. And then on the other side of it, there's an oil loading facility. There's a less than carload platform there, another one along here, and a warehouse design over here, as well as along here, plus the 2 sidings that head back for storing other cars. The Rigby yard in South Portland, I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. I was limited by the 12 feet of space in the room, and I could spend half an hour on this one. It's a little challenging. The drill track, the lead track, goes through this wall another 4 feet into a space where there's a harbor scene, so that the yard switcher has room to pull back a cut of cars on the 2 arrival and departure tracks here. They're not real long, but Portland wasn't as big as Boston, so it wouldn't have as much. You got 4 sub tracks for classification purposes. You've got an ice house, a caboose track, an engine shed, and the roundhouse. And I could use this as a repair track. but there's not much room on this end for an engine to be able to uncouple from the train, come down onto this dead end siding because there's a river that runs through here. There's just enough room for a 462 steam engine to be able to back in here and pull down and get to the turntable. If we had more time, I'd love to throw this one out for questions for people. If you had this space, what would you do to redesign it, keeping those 10 commandments in mind? I'd also change the angle of these curves. They're a little too tight for some of what I like to do. I don't run big boys on my layout because no way would those make around those curves. And these are the two pictures of that yard on the main level. Water tower. Haven't decided yet whether I'm going to put coaling facility there or whether it'll just be a post steam era yard. And that's the last of the slides. Time for a little Q&A if people have some questions or want me to go back over any of the earlier slides. I appreciate the chance to share my love of the hobby and the fun I had doing a little more research on how yards can work and work better.
Anybody have any questions for Paul?
I have a question. Last week when you were talking, you were showing some of the different tracks coming into the yard, and you mentioned names for them. Can you explain what each one of those names were?
Sure.
Like a drill track and things like that.
Yeah, and please, guys, if some of you who actually work railroads know that I'm using the wrong term, by all means, please let me know. If you want, I'll pull up the picture of my yard. Let me go back up to is that where I want to be? Yeah. What I call the drill track is I've been reading this last week, is also called the lead track, where it's the track where the yard switcher can come down onto one of the arrival and departure tracks and pull back a cut of cars. And I've got enough room between this turnout and the end of this track to have a cut of 10 40-foot boxcars, which is a nice long cut. Not that I do that many, but it's long enough to be able to handle that. And then from there, it's going to push those forward onto these 6 classification tracks. Of course, you got the main line, I use double main line all the way around the layout. But the lead track, as I understand it, is where it seems to be. Come on, help me out, guys. I think the lead track is the same as the drill track, but I don't want to educate people wrong. If somebody wants to help correct me on that one. I hear silence.
Seems like you're good to go.
Okay. Ice house for adding ice and salt to boxcars that need to keep things cold. The caboose runaround track. Cabooses are stored here, and you've got the ability to put the yard switcher on either end to pick up a caboose or drop one off. You've got a repair track here as well as here. The ash dump here for steam engines that need to get rid of the residual ashes from burning the coal, that's here. And this track can be used to pick up the ashes into a gondola. The outbound engine is going to use this track to get water and coal if it's a steam engine. And this track would be used to provide coal to be brought up into the top of the tower. These two tracks go to the diesel shed, and there are 3 tracks in the roundhouse and 5 more on the outside. There we go, that one. Then on the other end, you've got the 3 arrival and departure tracks, the 2 main lines. And I had the 2 main lines drop down maybe an inch from this level because I wanted some more 3D quality to this whole section of the layout. And the classification tracks, starting with this one, I'll go downhill towards Boston so that there's a little bit of a drop there, again, adding a little more 3D quality to it. There's a runaround track back here so that if the yard switcher is picking up a box car from the ice house, it's going to pull it back and drop it here, uncouple, come around the runaround track and pick it back up and pull it up so that it can put it onto the train. I think those were the main terms that I was using. Are there others that I haven't covered to answer your question?
No, that's quite thorough.
Okay.
I wasn't quick enough on the mute button, but yeah, yard lead is what we always called it.
Okay, yard lead.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know where the term drill track came from. I know I heard it from one of the modelers here in town. Do any of you know if that is a term that is used for some of that, or did yard lead replace that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like I say, we always called it a yard lead.
Okay.
I'd never heard it called a drill track before, but could be a rail fan term, could be something, and maybe the East Coast guys called it something different. Who knows?
Yeah, I did a little Wikipedia search for that and couldn't find it defined anywhere. So I'll have to ask around when our guys get together next Tuesday and see if anybody can help me with that one.
I was kind of like, I always heard angle bars called fish plates in some areas of the country. And I thought, fish plates? Now that's interesting.
Gotcha.
Anybody else have any questions? Well, Paul, thank you so very much. I really do appreciate it. And look forward to your next presentation when you get ready.
All right. Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
I've enjoyed it, fellas. Be well, stay well.